Hi there, I'm Danny Flexen. Welcome to the latest edition of SecondsOut FLEXpectations, where we take a look into the crystal ball and see what's coming in the world of boxing. We're here every Thursday, 4:30 p.m, and you'll have to excuse any kind of semblance of sweat on my head on this as I record it Thursday morning, because it is roasting, and all I've done really today is get out of bed and pull the bins back in from the dustman. It is ridiculously hot at the moment, and it probably is a good idea to look ahead to sometime later this year or even next year, as this week I want to talk about the whole Fury, Joshua and Dillian Whyte triangle and Eddie Hearn's role within it, because it must be one of the most difficult challenges in his promotional career to kind of balance the priorities when he has looked after Dillian Whyte for a long time, but AJ's the golden goose, and Fury against AJ is the biggest fight in the history of the sport. And this is a problem now that could have probably been avoided in April last year, when Dillian Whyte was offered a rematch with Anthony Joshua for the unified heavyweight titles. Now, I'm not criticising him for not taking it. At the time, several reasons were given, one of which was just the money wasn't good enough, another that he felt the plan was always for for Joshua to go out to the US to make his US debut against Jarrell Miller, which eventually became Andy Ruiz Jr., who shocked the world, albeit briefly, and that he was never really given due consideration. And another issue was the rematch clause, in which even if he'd have defeated Joshua, there was a rematch clause in the contract that wouldn't have paid him what he felt he would then be worth as the new world champion. I imagine, I've got no source on this, but I would imagine what he was offered in that rematch clause was less than Andy Ruiz Jr. ended up getting for fighting Joshua in the Saudi Arabia rematch. But I guess we'll never know, because the parties probably won't talk about it. So this week, the main development, if at all, if you can call it a development, in the Fury-Joshua undisputed heavyweight title fight negotiations appears to be the departure from the scene of Daniel Kinahan, the polarising figure who was, until recently, Fury's advisor, and apparently, reportedly, purportedly, isn't anymore. I'm not sure how true that is, if he's still kind of pulling the strings or at least advising Tyson behind the scenes. We don't know, but officially on the record, Fury has apparently told Bob Arum, and Bob Arum said this publicly, that Kinahan is no longer involved in negotiations for that fight and no longer works with Fury. He's graciously agreed to step back. Perhaps a lot of the negative publicity had some influence there, at least in terms of his official capacity. So it's removed one of the, I wouldn't say it was a barrier towards the fight being made, but certainly a barrier towards the fight being widely accepted. So we're looking ahead to 2021. Joshua has still got to get past his IBF mandatory, of course, in Kubrat Pulev. Tyson Fury has a probably December third fight with Deontay Wilder to negotiate in defence of his WBC belt. Alexander Usyk's pressing his claim as the WBO mandatory, but he's still got a rescheduled fight to take on with Derek Chisora, and may, because he's co-promoted by Matchroom, may be more willing to wait or step aside than some of the other guys. Then that leaves the WBC mandatory contender, Dillian Whyte, and it's further complicated by the fact that he is also working with Matchroom. Now, you think that would make things easier, but I don't think Whyte's keen to step aside yet again. And Eddie Hearn, at least publicly, is backing that, saying, you know, Whyte's waited a long time. I mean, it's July last year, so it's only actually not even a year yet since he's been mandatory, but he has been WBC #1, which isn't the same thing, for a lot longer than that. And Eddie Hearn said they'll press the claim, and ideally, Joshua would defend against Whyte early 2021, before the Fury fight can be made in the summer. If we look beyond the words given to online outlets, you've got to think, would he really want to risk the biggest fight, certainly in British history, maybe across globally, to accommodate Dillian Whyte? And it is a risk as well, because there's no guarantee that Joshua gets past Whyte. Yeah, Whyte rocked him in the first fight, but other than that was pretty comfortably beaten. But Whyte's improved a huge amount since, not just as a fighter, but also as an attraction. After turning down that Joshua rematch, he's been a headliner on Sky Sports box office, I think twice, and it'll be 3 times when he rounds off the fight camp concept on August 22nd against Alexander Povetkin, which I expect him to get past that fight, although again, it's no easy feat. So White could upset the apple cart, and then you think, well, there is a plus for Matchroom there in that Fury and White could then be made for all the marble. Joshua and White could then be made for all the marbles. It's a huge fight, rematch angle, sell out Wembley, and it's an all Matchroom affair, so it makes it easier to negotiate, certainly with TV companies, be on Sky Sports here, DAZN in the US, etc., etc. But White has proven himself, even with Hearn, who he's worked with for a long time, to be an incredibly tough negotiator. And I think it might be hard to make, just as it was hard to make and eventually didn't get made in April 2019. So, and that's if White wins. There's also the possibility that White fights Fury. Fury comes out on top, but White makes him look bad, and it devalues to an extent the Joshua Fury fight. There's also the chance that White cuts Fury, which delays any Joshua Fury fight. There's so many things that can happen between now and then, and White presents just another obstacle, and probably the most formidable obstacle in the way of that fight that we all want to see happening. And Eddie Hearn, I think, wants to see that fight too. Joshua, by that point, will have had a certain number of defences. He's made his money. He'll be confident going into the Fury fight. And it's time to really have that undisputed world title clash, the first ever between two Brits. It's an incredible concept, but Dillian Whyte could still be the fly in the ointment. And for Eddie Hearn, it's a very tricky position to be in. You know, there's been talks before that Whyte is a free agent and he could go to other people. Frank Warren said publicly that if Whyte were with him, he'd have already had a world title shot by now. Now, whether that's true or not, Whyte must be hearing these things and must have kind of an inkling that, hey, maybe I could do better somewhere else. Maybe my value has increased to the extent now that I don't necessarily need the Matchroom and Sky Sports machine behind me. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that at all, but he would be mad not to at least consider that possibility. And then you've got Eddie Hearn wanting to make the biggest fight for Joshua. I don't think Joshua particularly wants to fight Whyte again, not because he fears him or anything like that, but just because he knows there's a time frame on his career and he wants the biggest fight as possible. And there's no bigger fight out there now than Tyson Fury. And until those guys clash, Joshua will be haunted with A, people saying that Fury's the #1 heavyweight in the world, not him. And B, when are you going to fight Tyson Fury? It's the question he's always going to get. Certainly more than when are you going to fight Dillian Whyte again. So Joshua's going to be pushing Hearn on one side to make the Fury fight and get rid of the obstacles and make it as, uncomplicated as possible. Whyte's going to be pushing him from the other side saying, hey, you've promised me this Joshua fight. I know I turned it down before, but I'm the WBC mandatory. The whole thing before was I said I'd get in a mandatory position. It'd guarantee me more money, more sway in the negotiations. Now I'm here. What are you going to do about it? And Eddie Hearn's got to look at what's best for him, not in the short term, because unquestionably that's Joshua against Fury, but in the long term, if Joshua loses to Fury, yeah, there'll be a second fight. That's big as well. But then does he want to lose Whyte forever, potentially, for passing him over to make the bigger fight that if Joshua loses both times, Joshua will probably retire. Whyte's moved on because he's not happy with Hearn not putting him first. And then who's Hearn got as the next top heavyweight coming through? So there's a lot of things to consider. And yeah, in an ideal world, Fury would fight Whyte in early 2021, but that means more difficult negotiations between Hearn's team and Warren's team, or Aram's team, however you look at it. And then, in an ideal world, Fury would probably get through that and fight Joshua twice in the rest of 2021, although 3 fights a year for top-level heavyweights fighting marquee fights seems unlikely. It's just a messy situation, and one I'm sure Hearn would prefer to have avoided. Want to know what you guys think about it though. Would you like to see Fury accommodate Whyte first, or would you like to see Whyte wait even longer, but so we can see Fury versus Joshua, Joshua versus Fury, whichever way around you prefer? And what do you think Eddie Hearn will ultimately decide as a way through this? Be great to hear what you think. I'll be back on Monday for Reflections, 4:30, and next week's FLEXpectations, same time, but on Thursday. Really appreciate your time, and I will see you all soon. Cheers.